Hello everybody, welcome back to my deck guide series. In these videos, I condense a full detailed deck guide into a shorter video packed full of quality information. I'll cover card choices, deck strategy, tech options, and more as we dive into today's deck. Speaking of which, today's deck is my favorite way to play Ruby Amethyst going into set 6. This is Ruby Amethyst Shark Burn, an aggressive action-based deck that aims to win the game as fast as possible, utilizing some great card combos. Here's a quick look at my set 5 burn deck. I was playing a lot of this deck at the end of last set with a lot of success, and it's a blast to play. But with the introduction of cards like Maui Half-Shark and even Thievery in Azurite Sea, this deck has even more potential now. So let's dive in and break down this new Azurite Sea deck. Ruby Amethyst Burn is a consistent aggro deck that slowly gains lore through various characters and actions and can close out almost any game by drawing enough uninteractable lore gaining cards. I recommend this deck if you like an aggro playstyle without reliance on fragile characters, explosive mid-game lore gains, a consistent low uninkable deck list that can flex with the meta, and puzzly play sequences that reward patience and skill. I'm going to show off two lists today. First, this main list here that leaves out the typical Madam Mim bounce cards from Amethyst, but I'll also show a second list with the bounce packages included towards the end. Either way, the goal of this deck is to reach double-digit lore relatively fast and then finish out the game with a series of quick lore-gaining cards. In addition to Merlin Goat as expected, this deck makes use of action-based lore. As a basic premise, if you were to successfully play 4 copies of Thievery, Gathering Lore and Knowledge, and A Pirate's Life, that's 20 lore right there. Take this concept and fuel the burn engine with consistent turn-after-turn card draw with Amethyst Chromacon, and you have a recipe for spicy success. This is an aggressive deck that not only avoids relying on fragile questing characters, but almost all of its lore, whether via Goat or an action like Gathering, is uninteractable. You gain the lore immediately when your cards are played, so you're ready to race to 20 before any other deck can respond. Combine these actions with Maui Half-Shark, and now you're really rapid-firing out the lore left and right. But we'll talk more about him soon enough. The Shark Burn deck opens with Chernobog's Followers, Diablo Obedient Raven, and Cusco Wanted Llama. I'll refer to these characters, along with Magic Broom, as the 4 banish and draw characters in Amethyst. These opening characters, although not lore aggressive, are crucial inclusions that provide the deck with important early resources. Their goal is to gain 1 or 2 lore, and then draw you a card, digging further into your deck as they replace themselves. The banish and draw characters also work super well curving into Merlin Crab. Even though the aim isn't to challenge with this deck, the synergy is very strong, allowing you to respond to threats such as rival aggro decks and early locations. At its core, this burn deck essentially puts your opponents on a timer, so efficient crab trades to halt their progress can really set you up for success. Throughout the early game, look to weave in at least 1 Amethyst Chromacon. This item is a core part of this deck. Because of all the juicy lore cards in your deck, slowing down to play this item out early actually speeds you up over time towards your eventual goal. With 2 or 3 of these out, your ability to reach game-ending lore cards is almost trivial. You're drawing 3 or 4 cards each turn after all. And every card in this deck is screaming to be played quick, racing towards 20 lore. Yes, there is a downside of Amethyst Chromacon. Your opponents are gaining cards too, and that can be problematic. However, their resource gain is countered by the very nature of this deck. Everything you draw is way more effective at crossing that finish line. This deck basically says, let's both speedrun drawing 20 cards and see whose are better. Jumping back to the characters now, we have Merlin Goat, of course, a classic character that gains at least 2 lore, and he's supported by Super Goof, which still to this day is a severely underrated character. He's a very important piece of this list, helping you close out games against steel decks that drop Pete, hoping to shut down your action-based lore plans. If you're in a best of 3 against a player with Pete, they're gonna catch on quick and start holding him for later, shutting down common finishing combos like 8 Ink Pirate's Life plus Gathering or Shark Maui plus Gathering. Goofy really shines in these scenarios, able to gain 2 lore in a pinch, and often 4 lore when used with LeFou Instigator. LeFou isn't a super common choice for this deck, but I'm a huge fan and highly recommend him. He pairs well with almost every character here, enabling fun ideas with Crab, Peter Pan, Maui, and more. For defensive options, the big one is Be Prepared, of course. It's simply here to shut down your opponent's board, resetting and stalling as you prepare to dig and find that last bit of lore to cross the finish line. If you're forced to play Be Prep on 7, but you're already at 12 or so lore, the game is likely still headed in your favor. Other defensive cards like Brawl and Peter Pan Shadowfinder are obvious inclusions to fight Diablo and other early annoyances. I previously played Vanellope instead of Shadowfinder. She can hit Diablo while he's in a cove, and she quests for 2 lore. However, going into set 6, the bonus synergy of Shadowfinder with the evasive shark Maui is surprisingly impactful. Finally, Prince Eric is here to turn up more pressure, taking down an enemy with him whenever he's banished. Don't underestimate this inclusion, he's often the MVP of the deck when you least expect it. And of course, as the deck's name suggests, I do have 4 copies of Maui Half-Shark. I won't talk too long about him since I'm sure you've already heard enough about the potential of this card, but he of course boosts the potency of the lore actions in this deck, and if he challenges a character, you can gain an action back to your hand from your discard. Sometimes this helps gain back Be Prep after it's discarded with Ursula or Bare Necessities, but often you'll just grab Gathering Knowledge and Wisdom, ready to go right away and gain 3 lore. This can be a quick final blow in many games. Also, remember to combine Maui with LeFou to recall 2 actions in one turn. Even if there's only 1 copy of Thievery or Gathering in the discard, you can challenge with Maui to return the action and then play it, and then play LeFou, readying Maui to challenge again, then return and play the action again. That is a specific scenario that won't happen often, but it is possible and it is ever threatening. Now keep in mind the core of this deck is extremely functional even without Shark Maui, and I could see a reality where the best and most optimized version of this deck is one with 2 or 3 copies or perhaps even no copies of Maui, instead leaning into consistent card draw and a smaller, quicker inkwell. But Maui is a shiny new set 6 card, and I'm really excited about the power he brings to this deck. Last but not least, let's talk about these 2 copies of It Calls Me. This is a rarely utilized card, but it's one of my favorite innovations for this list. It's a 1-cost action that draws a card, so yes, it does gain a lore off Maui if he's on board, but that's sort of an extra bonus. The main goal of its inclusion is as an anti-meta tech card. It Calls Me also throws 3 cards back into your opponent's deck from their discard. The idea is to dilute their deck with ineffective cards, especially as they draw repeatedly off Chromacons. And more specifically, going into the early Azurite Sea meta, there are a lot of decent targets for It Calls Me. You can toss back Lilo Escape Artist, shutting down her ability to spawn back on the board each turn. Depending on what decks rise up in the format, this can be a really unique way to answer their threats while still being very synergistic with your deck list. After all, even without those tech ideas in mind, I really like how easily this card slots into this deck's synergies, while still at its core being a simple pay 1, draw 1. So if you decide to try this deck out, keep these important combos in mind. 3 ink is when you'll typically respond to opponents through Merlin Crab, or your Brawl or Shadowfinder. Otherwise, this is a great time to slam Chromacon. 4 ink is another opportunity to play out a Chromacon, and even playing out 2 can work if you find them, and there's nothing on board that needs to be addressed by Brawl, Crab, Peter Pan, you get the idea. Things get more interesting with later combos. At 6 ink, Super Goof plus LeFou is very fun and very deadly. This is also a good combo to keep in mind on turn 7, as your opponent will often strip Be Prep out of your hand going into 7 ink. You can also simply set up Maui Half-Shark here, especially on the play, and see if your opponent has a way to take him out before you enter into some closing action combos. At 8 ink, if you haven't already, you can play out Maui plus an action like Gathering or Thievery. 8 ink also allows a Pirate's Life plus Gathering on the same turn. And keep in mind, Maui can also sing a Pirate's Life himself, allowing your ink to go elsewhere. Speaking of singing, once Merlin Crab and Peter Pan have done their jobs, be on the lookout for an opportunity for them to sing together a pirate's life. Alright, this short video guide is already going kinda long here, but we gotta talk about the Mulligan Strategy for this deck. It's super important to keep any Chromacons in your opening hand. Even if you see 3 of them, I'd consider keeping all of them unless you don't see one of your 1-drops yet. The other exception would be if you think or know your opponent is playing a whole new world. Other than Chromacon, your Mulligan priorities are pretty standard. You want something for turns 1 and 2, so you'll prioritize your banish and draw characters. And of course, Brawl is also great in almost every matchup. Everything else can be thrown back, especially Goats, Actions, and LeFou. He's not great to play early on. He does have some interesting uses early, but later on is where he can really shine. Now let me briefly cover the Madam Mim Bounce version of this deck. With Snake added, I also like 2 more 1-drops as targets, so Magic Broom makes an appearance. The inclusion of Snake and Fox means this deck emphasizes combos with Goat more, bouncing for lore in that way instead of a more focused game plan on the action-based lore. This means another new Azurite Sea card, the White Rose, is able to join in and make use of those bounce synergies. She doesn't gain lore when leaving the board, but a 3-cost 3/3 is still a very solid character regardless. Pretty much everything else about this version of the deck is very similar. Alright, now that I've gone through everything, let's talk about additional considerations. As always, there are several great choices for this deck that need to be considered. If you want more lore from the early game, the Flynn Sisu line is still a good combo. I do think it's tough running important 2 willpower characters right now. With Flynn, Piglet, and Diablo, all with big early game impact, many decks have Brawl or Storm to deal with them. But if Flynn does stick, he can really ruin someone's day with the lore he rakes in. Also, even without Flynn, who can be a liability against some decks like I just mentioned, I do like running Sisu solo sometimes. She's extremely resilient and almost always results in 2 lore. Plus, she has a natural synergy with Chromacon, as your opponents will always have a pretty full hand, giving her a ton of strength. If you want more card draw in this deck, running all 3 1-drops can definitely help, but you could also add in either Genie or Rabbit, depending on if you have your Mim Bounce package in. However, before you throw these or another card like Friends on the Other Side in, I recommend you give this deck a try without those. Between the banish and draw characters and Amethyst Chromacon, there truly is plenty of draw power in this deck in the vast majority of games. You won't even notice the lack of Friends or Rabbit, seriously. Something you might miss though are locations. I've cut them going into set 6, but they aren't bad by any means, and there's a few reasons why you may still want them. The library is very good with the 4 banish and draw characters, and the Queen's Castle is a pressure machine. Both locations also synergize beautifully with Be Prepared, of course. Finally, cards like Rush Maui and Rush Elsa are missing and could be considered. However, the inclusion of Crab or Fox really do a lot of heavy lifting, especially in my versions of this deck that run LeFou Instigator. LeFou plus Crab or Fox with the bonus addition of other Rush characters like Super Goof and Peter Pan Shadowfinder really keep this deck consistent with its game plan, while also injecting the flexibility to go defensive, busting characters and locations when necessary. Overall, this is an extremely fun deck to play, and I encourage you guys to give it a try. Even though it is Ruby Amethyst, this deck feels like a breath of fresh air, a very different playstyle from the standard mainline bounce deck. Alright everyone, thanks for watching. Make sure to like and subscribe, and let me know what deck you want me to break down next time. And until then, peace.